Ladies and gentlemen, let's get into the video. AMD are planning to launch the Arctic Islands, also known as the AMD 400 series, by summer 2016, with massive improvements on both performance per watt and, of course, featuring high bandwidth memory too. So if these rumours are to be believed, it would tie in rather nicely with what we've already learned regarding the timelines and introductions of AMD's new GPUs. And in fact the APUs and CPUs as well. It wasn't too long ago that Dr. Lisa Su, during an earnings teleconference, said, and I quote, "I think it's fair to say that the graphics portfolio is quite broad, so you will see us updating the entire portfolio over the coming quarters. We are focused on delivering our next generation GPUs in 2016 to improve performance per watt by 2 times compared to the current offerings, based on design architectural improvements as well as advanced FinFET processors." This also ties in with TSMC. Their 16FF Plus process is already in volume production, and that's rather important. It basically means that their refineries, their capabilities to actually manufacture silicon is not just in very small quantities anymore. They're able to produce enough of the chips to satisfy consumer demand. And by the way, in terms of consumer demand, we're not referring to us, we are referring to Nvidia and AMD and anyone else who actually requires them to produce high volumes of silicon. At the end of the day, AMD need this to be able to satisfy, of course, their customers, which in that case is us. So why are so many so excited about the 400 series? Well, for that matter, why are so many people so interested in Pascal as well? Well, since 2012, we've been on 28nm. 28nm is pretty old by now, at least in computing standards. And when AMD first introduced the HD 7000 series, so for the sake of argument, if you've got a Radeon 7970, 7950, something like that in your PC, it's very much the same technology as what we are using now, even in Fury. The GCN architecture hasn't really undergone any major changes. There have been some architecture improvements without question. For example, improvements in tessellation, we've seen the introduction of high bandwidth memory 1, and even color compression, and this is the same thing for Nvidia as well. Once again, the Kepler architecture has of course gone under some revisions, but it's not quite where they would expect it to be at this point. And we know of course that Nvidia have had to actually postpone a couple of their launches, and they're not quite as far along as they hoped, even with the introduction of Pascal as kind of a bridge gap between Kepler and Volta. Or sorry, Maxwell and Volta to be more precise. So what does that mean? Well, big things, because as I mentioned, well, rather Dr. Lisa Su mentioned, they are hoping for twice the performance per watt compared to both R9 Fury and the 300 series of cards, which is going to make significant improvements to just how you and I are going to be playing PC games, at least in theory. It is worth noting, however, that there is still some ambiguity regarding the process size. Despite the fact that many believe that it will be 16nm, there is also an equal amount of evidence to show that it could end up being 14nm. If that is indeed the case, and of course 14nm will be by Global Foundries. Now 14nm will also be rather impressive when it comes to low power production for APUs. It's still not 100% confirmed yet, so there is still a great deal of speculation, but either way, whether it ends up being 16nm, whether it ends up being 14nm, it would appear that the timelines match up rather beautifully. But ultimately, as I mentioned, this is going to be a rather interesting battle, because to be honest with you, I think stagnation has been a massive problem with the GPU industry, and it's not really a fault of Nvidia, it's not really a fault of AMD, it's just kind of how the market has been. We've had memory problems, in other words, there's just not enough bandwidth on current chips. We've had, despite the fact that of course we have had bus widths getting wider and wider, but now with the introduction of not just HBM, but also GDDR5X, we're starting to see that hurdle, at least for now, get pushed to the wayside. But also other deals, such as API support with both Mantle, DirectX 12, Vulkan. The next generation GPUs are able to push a lot more on screen. But I think perhaps one of the biggest driving forces for the need for more powerful GPUs is without doubt virtual reality, as well as the next generation monitors such as FreeSync and G-Sync enabled displays, plus of course the fact that 4K is becoming much more prevalent, with 4K monitors becoming cheaper and cheaper. But even to run a basic 4K system that's just at 60 FPS, it requires an awful lot of power, and to be honest with you, GPUs now just don't really have it. Even if you have a kick-ass card such as, let's say, the Fury X or the 980 Ti, in many games they will just simply struggle, particularly if you're starting to run high levels of MSAA or even high levels of shadows, lighting. It just absolutely decimates the performance levels of modern day cards. What we do know is that Arctic Islands has already been taped out. They are on track for mass production, and that is incredibly important. It means that essentially AMD are done with bug testing. They know that the silicon works. There's no major issues they need to resolve. They know that the silicon isn't going to suddenly explode. They're fairly happy with what they were aiming for. Basically, the product is essentially complete at this point. What they're probably doing now is ensuring that what speeds can they get the cores at? What are they going to launch? For example, how many shaders are the various models of GPU going to do? And some of that will be down to the final production silicon. So for the sake of argument, let's say that you have a GPU is running 1,000, you have considerably more, but this just uses for the sake of argument. Let's say the top of the line model runs at 1,000 shaders. They may decide there's an awful lot of them which end up with like 800 shaders enabled. Hey, we can make the second highest card in our lineup run with that, and of course that's all down to yields bidding, speed bidding, and AMD are probably figuring all of this out with their partners, and eventually of course we will have a pretty good idea of their lineup. I don't think it will be too much longer now. What makes this significantly more interesting, however, is that according to benchlife.info, Gemini, known as the Fury X2, is going to be paper launching this month, but it's not going to actually hit market availability until the first quarter of 2016, and basically is probably going to face potential delays. Now, why is this important? Well, if the card's not going to be available until at least January, but essentially it's going to be very limited quantities, it's going to mean that many gamers are probably just going to skip over the damn thing. I mean, once again, it does depend on what your budgets are, that type of deal, but essentially AMD has delivered engineering samples. We know that because it's been spotted on shipping manifests. So yeah, we know AMD are shipping out samples. We know that, yeah, it works. But if they're not able to actually deliver them in significant quantities, it just doesn't make a difference. And let's face it, we know that the Fury X is pretty expensive. It's, you know, around the $600 mark. Obviously depends upon the vendor, depends upon the manufacturer and whether you can get rebates and all that stuff, but it's not a cheap card. So you could imagine what the Fury X2 is going to end up being. The 295 X2 was around $1,500, but did quite quickly crash in price thanks to fierce competition from Nvidia, and obviously Nvidia and AMD have been trying to fight each other on the dual GPU fronts for some time. Essentially speaking, I think that the Fury X2 could be a bit of a weird launch. I think that AMD are going to be doing it kind of as a thought experiment, plus the fact that it would be nice for PR for them to say, hey, we released this card which has like 16 teraflops of computing performance and like 8,000 and whatever the hell it ends up being, shaders and all this stuff. It's really good to say that you've got one of the fastest cards in the market, just to say it, because essentially it's going to carry them with that momentum into the next generation. But for many gamers, I have the feeling that you're probably going to be best skipping over it. it's kind of an exciting time. I know I keep rabbiting on about the fact that the next year is going to be really cool, but I honestly believe it will be. DirectX 12 is cool. You know, I've done a lot of analysis of DirectX 12. I've seen a lot of stuff, but essentially, it's kind of just DirectX 11 on steroids at the moment. There are certainly things you could not do on DirectX 11 in terms of the number of units and stuff, but essentially a lot of the games aren't massive leaps, and it's going to be a while before that, you know, before DirectX 11 based hardware on DirectX 11 based systems are left in the lurch, and the games are built from the ground up to really utilize DX12 or Vulkan, because obviously at the moment the vast majority of users, yes, are considering Windows 10 upgrades, but not enough for studios to say, hey, you know what, if you're not running Windows 10, you're out of luck. That's not happened yet, has it? And of course that happened with DirectX 9 and as subsequently DirectX 10 and subsequently DirectX 11. It's worth noting that DX9 and DX11 had quite fast industry support, but DX12 is, from what I've heard, from what developers have stated, it's actually quicker. They're adopting it much faster in terms of what they need, and I don't blame them, because to be honest, DirectX 11 is really old right now. You know, Microsoft have made some significant improvements to it over the years, but they just can't do anything because the base code is just not, you know, it's just not good enough for modern systems. So I think that once again with virtual reality, the next generation manufacturing processes, and honestly the first real shift in GCN architecture, the fact that AMD have said, hey, you know, when Arctic Islands come out, it's going to really be a shift in how we're putting out cards, and that's going to be rather interesting in my opinion for APUs as well, because the company's APUs, they're pretty okay at the moment, but Zen obviously is going to be instrumental in the APU performance as well, because with that introduction of a new architecture, it should in theory provide pretty large gains on the IPC, which is something that AMD have had problems with regarding floating point performance particularly. Anyway, hopefully you've enjoyed the video. I'll see you soon. Take care. Bye for now.